when you talk about incentivizing systems, how would you see that? What does that look like?
that's a great question. I was actually hoping you guys would help me answer that. I mean, we do see a lot of talk and a big push for, paying farmers to sequester carbon. This seems to be getting more and more and more attention. Um, there's a lot of work to do before that comes online, but I've in the past I've thought about programs like CRP or CSP, um, but there needs to be incentives, and I think it's more than just economic incentives. Social incentives would be useful too, just to make it clear that we, of course, want and need productivity, but there are so many other things that we're looking to our working lands to provide for us, and we need to make it clear that we value those services that farmers help us attain.
Okay, there's a question in the chat box. What are the three other parts of the trials? You said there were 9.
Yes, there are 9. 6 are the core cropping systems. We also have 3 perennial grasslands. We have a high diversity prairie, a low diversity prairie, and a switchgrass, a monoculture switchgrass. And because the output from those systems really doesn't fit, if you will, in the context of energy output, we haven't included them. Those systems provide kind of one extreme control. The soils at Wix are mollisols. They formed under prairies, and so having prairies there provides us kind of a biogeochemical or soil health control. At the other end, I would say, is our continuous corn system, where for 31 years we've planted corn and tilled it. And so that really provides kind of a biogeochemical or soil health reference. And I'd be happy to just kind of like talk outside of the context of what I presented today on those systems.
Gene writes, would there be soil health benefits to reincorporating a grazing and cropping system?
Reincorporating, does that mean integrating a grazing and cropping system? I'm going to assume that's what that means, unless something
Yes,
comes up.
that's what his response was. Yes.
Okay. I think absolutely. I mean, annual systems are tricky. We know that there are things that we can do to annual systems to make them better for soil health. I'm sure that this group does a lot of cover crops research. We know that integrating crops and livestock can improve soil health because it necessitates forage crops. It necessitates some return of manure. But grasslands are by far the most beneficial in terms of soil health, primarily because it necessitates a complete lack of tillage while they're in. But then you also have a considerable amount of below ground fine root biomass. And so we often think about permanent pastures, and those could be really well managed pastures, management intensive rotational grazing, being super healthy for the soil. But in Europe, there's a lot of work with grass lays where you do have a temporary rotational pasture that might be in for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then we go back into grain crops. And we would expect, whether that pasture is being used as a hay crop or whether it's being used as a grazing crop, for that grass phase to make a considerable impact in things like aggregate stability, microbial biomass, soil carbon. All of those things should come along with that grass presence.
We have another question from Todd. Does this research question whether organic tillage is really a long-term soil health benefit? If you could take a look at that, I'm not quite sure I understand that.
And let me see if I can pull up
in the chat.
I am not seeing the chat box right now.
Todd,
I
would
mean,
you want to rephrase your question? I
Yeah,
unmuted your microphone.
Okay. Yes. So if we look at this, I think there's so much of our public that seems to think that organic is the way to go, that are some way, that are paying premiums for organic. But do we have to be really careful about, if we look at some of this, it's showing that there's degrading soil when we're doing tillage. And so a lot of the organic systems have to have tillage in there, but they're probably destroying a lot of the beneficial fungi. And so do we need to re-quantify what's a good soil and what isn't, that way?
yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it kind of gets down a little bit to the fact that it's hard to find a system that can do everything we want it to. I think that much of the interest in organics from a consumer standpoint come from the idea of, and I'm not defending or throwing anything under the bus, but the idea that there's potentially less petrochemical inputs in a system like that, so less potential to consume something. But it's absolutely the case that tillage breaks up hyphal networks, it breaks up aggregates, it oxidizes carbon. I haven't talked about it today, but a lot of the research we do at WIXT looks at the long term, and I'm talking 20, 30-year impacts of these systems on soil carbon. And I can tell you that the only systems that we see any kind of progress in the way of building carbon are the systems that are perennial, and even above and beyond that, the systems that are grasslands. That tillage does have a big impact on what we would consider kind of classic soil health metrics. And I think that's why, Aaron Silva and a number of other colleagues in the north central US are trying to figure out how to do no-till or reduced till organic, because they also recognize the importance of keeping that soil stable.
hey, Greg, there's another question from Dave. Can we have more detail on the difference between perenniality and living color? Is perenniality 100%?
Right. Oh, that's a great question too. So, and perenniality is not a great term. So I would love, maybe even to crowdsource ideas, but living cover is simply, if we take a look at the crop rotation or system, take a look at the system, we look at how long there's green cover on that soil. So we take account how many phases are in the rotation and how long during the growing season we have green cover. And we can calculate a metric of what that living cover is. Perenniality is a term we came up with to kind of say, okay, living cover is one thing, but soil stability is another thing. For example, our organic systems have a lot of living cover because they use cover crops, but they also have a lot of tillage. And so perenniality is a metric where we combine how much living cover we have in a system with how little tillage we have. So more green on the soil and less soil disturbance gives you a higher relative perenniality, which is why we're calling it relative. It's not that it's a perennial system, but it's that soil is more stable and covered for a longer portion of the time. And that's critical. I mean, it is really closely related to those kind of metrics of soil structure, aggregate stability, things that would lead to water stability and water holding capacity.
Very good. We've got one more.
Okay.
How would you set a baseline in regions whose natural covers were hardwood forests as opposed to grassland if similar system assessment was done? Does grassland set the soil health standard too high for such areas' true potential?
Both good questions. I'm going to start with the grassland setting the standard too high for such areas' true potential. I think if you were looking at a forested ecosystem, so you're working with alpha sols or some other forest soil, then you would want to have your kind of native control be a forest. It wouldn't be fair necessarily to compare those to grasslands. From the standpoint of Wixt, and I would say for the standpoint of the vast majority of the Corn Belt, which is dominated by mollisols that developed under the tallgrass prairie, 3,000 or 4,000 years, 5,000 years of tallgrass prairies impact on soil health is kind of, at least in a past climate, was, the steady state that we had reached. And so that would be a high bar for our soil health. If we could get back in that direction. The climate's changing. It's not in steady state now, so that becomes a little bit complicated. But if you were working in a predominantly hardwood forest region, I think you would want to set your, your control or your baseline as forested land. I do think that with agricultural production, particularly if irrigation is involved, you could actually drive soil health indices beyond a forest ecosystem's soil health indices, but that gets complicated too, because then we're talking about irrigation being in the swing.